We are in our, I don't know what week of the series this is, probably our third week, I think. When I graduated from high school, my first job was at a country club here in town. I got a job on the grounds crew at a very nice private golf club. And showed up for my first day on the job. It was the day after my high school graduation. So I had to be at the golf course at 5 a.m. the day after. I stayed up all night with my friends because we had just graduated from high school. And on my first day, I fell asleep on the job in one of those Cushman deals somewhere. I don't know where I was, but I fell asleep. But my boss found me my first day on the job. And you got to understand, when I showed up for the interview, this is a golf course grounds crew. I mean, I'm interviewing to mow stuff. I showed up in a shirt and tie. I wanted to look impressive or whatever. So I got hired, and I'm sure this guy had very high aspirations for me. Day one, I fall asleep on the job. He finds me. And so despite the fact that as a high school graduate, I was more educated than everyone else on the crew, he decided to put me on hand trimming bunkers and replacing ball marks with screwdrivers. Those were my first two jobs. Eventually, I graduated up out of that, and they decided, okay, we'll put Mike on a riding lawnmower. And so I started mowing what's called the step rough and the fairways. Little did they know, that me falling asleep on the job day one would be sort of an omen of things to come, right? So when you're sitting on a lawnmower every day in 90-degree heat, and the lawnmowers are hot and they're humming, and you can't listen to anything to keep yourself awake because this is swanky country club and that's tacky. So I'm just on this lawnmower. I fell asleep on this lawnmower all the time. And the worst was when you'd have to mow what's called a step rough, but you would mow. I was supposed to mow a straight strip from the tee box to the fairway. And oftentimes, when I would get done mowing this thing, I would have fallen asleep one or two times, between the tee box and the fairway, and I would turn around and it looked like this. And then, you got to understand, these are people who pay a lot of money to be a part of a really nice country club. When they get up to the tee box and they see the path that they're supposed to walk like this, or when they're actually on the fairway, and instead of having these nice, straight strips across, the lines, kind of look like this. Needless to say, I didn't stay on the riding lawnmower for very long. They ended up putting me on mowing greens because I guess they figured I couldn't fall asleep while actually walking. Joke's on them. No, it's not. I did it. Here's sort of the point of my humorous anecdote. I literally fell asleep at the wheel, but metaphorically, whenever we sort of fall asleep at the wheel of our lives, either we don't end up where we're supposed to end up, or we take a sort of circuitous route to get there. Right? You heard Landon in his sort of prayer as he read that piece from Eugene Peterson's book. We're going to talk about intentionality this morning. We've been doing this series on aspects of American culture that, if misunderstood or kind of uncritically accepted, have a tendency to shape us in ways that are contrary to the way of Jesus. And the one that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks is this topic, this aspect we call freedom. There is no word more synonymously associated with American culture than the word freedom. And the way we typically understand that word is the ability to do what we want. And what I've tried to argue in these few weeks is that is one way of thinking about freedom, and it's an important way to think about freedom. So you don't just throw that definition out entirely. But as a Christian person, freedom as the ability to do what you want is not the ultimate definition of freedom. And if you make it the ultimate definition of freedom, ironically, you're going to end up a slave. You're going to end up entrapped. Real freedom for the Christian person isn't the ability to do what we want, it's the capacity to do as we should. So the suggestion is pretty simple. You are freest, and you probably know this, you probably have experienced. You are freest when you are able to say no to the things that you ought to say no to, and yes to the things that you ought to say yes to. That's when you're the freest. When you can't say no to the thing you ought to say no to, but there's something in you that wants to do it and you just can't stop yourself from doing it, that's not an expression of freedom. That's an expression of slavery. And that's what happens when we pursue freedom just uncritically as the ability to do what we want. So what we're trying to do is discuss practices that, if engaged faithfully, can shape us in the other way. Not disregarding freedom as the ability to do what we want, but moving us toward freedom as the capacity to do as we should. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to read you a text from the Gospel of Luke. This is chapter 14, starting in verse 25. That's what Jesus says. A large crowd was following Jesus. He turned around and said to them, "If you want to be my disciple, you must hate everyone else by comparison. Your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, 'There's that person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it.' Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against it? And if he can't, he'll send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot be my disciple without giving up everything you own." So Jesus makes a distinction. He makes a distinction between accompanying him and being a disciple. So the first sentence in this section of verses I just read to you is that there was a large crowd following Jesus. That Greek word actually means to accompany. And I point it out only because in our culture, we tend to use the phrase following Jesus and disciple synonymously. Jesus is making a distinction between the two. There's a large group of people, right, larger than this group, and they are accompanying Jesus. They're walking with him where he's going. And we can imagine that they had mixed motives for that, just like you have mixed motives for it. Jesus was a miracle worker. If I had been alive at the time and I heard about some of the stuff that Jesus did, I probably would walk around with him just to see what he did. And I'm sure some of the people in the crowd did that for that reason. Most of these people would have been very poor. Some of the miracles that Jesus performed resulted in him feeding them. And so we know some people kind of hung around and accompanied him because they were looking for a meal. Jesus was a teacher. I'm sure some of these people genuinely wanted to learn something. Some of them were probably there because they'd been invited by a friend, or a spouse said, "Hey, it's Mother's Day, I want to go to church," right? They all have different reasons for hanging around. Jesus makes a distinction between what it means to hang around, to accompany him, and to be his disciple. And he's pretty honest that he prefers the latter to the former. That he didn't really come to try to, create large crowds of people to accompany him. That wasn't the idea. The idea was to turn people into disciples. Now, he's not looking at the crowd and telling anybody who's accompanying him to get lost, "Hey, if you're not serious about this, just get out of here." And he wouldn't say that to any of you, but he is being honest about the difference and what it is that he's trying to do and what it means. It's like he's looking at them and saying, "Look, but guys, before you walk too far, before you get too far away from home, I want you to know it's okay if you want to just accompany me, I guess, but that's not really what this is about. This is about becoming my disciple, and before you get too far into this, I want you to understand what that means. I want to be honest with you." Sometimes we get into things because we think that's what we want when we don't really know what the thing itself is. Marriage comes to mind. Most people want to get married because they think getting married is what they want, but none of them have any idea, including myself, what marriage actually is or how it works. That's one of God's gifts of grace to us, that we don't know what it is that we're getting ourselves into. Sometimes we get into things because we think we want them, not necessarily knowing what the thing is. Jesus doesn't want anybody sort of like coming in and just having no idea what this is about. So he just wants to be real upfront, real honest. So this is what he says. Essentially, we all live in a network of allegiances. We all have allegiances, right? Moms, dads, brothers, sisters, spouses, kids. We all have allegiances. And those allegiances place a constraint on our libertarian freedom, on that ability to just do whatever you want, right? Marriage limits you to one person. Kids limit everything. Everything. Thank you. Okay? So we have these allegiances. Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, it's kind of like that. It's pledging your allegiance. If you're going to be my disciple, you can't just think whatever you want or go wherever you want or do whatever you want or say whatever you want or believe whatever you want. That's not how it works. That if you're going to be my disciple, you're pledging your allegiance to me. Now, but here's the difference. The pledge of allegiance that you make to Jesus is ultimate. And that means two things, and he tells you. It means two things. One, it means it takes precedence over all other allegiances. So Jesus alone gets to decide in your life what is the meaning of life and how you are going to live it. No other allegiances, not relational allegiances, not national allegiances, not economic allegiances. None of the allegiances in your life, it doesn't mean that those things go away, that you don't have them. It just means that if they are ever in competition or in conflict with your commitment to pledge your allegiance to Jesus, Jesus wins. Jesus alone gets to determine the meaning of life and how we live it. So it's not just like a pledge of allegiance like we make to like everybody else or to other things. Jesus isn't like another ingredient in the recipe of life. Jesus is the recipe. So that's one thing one aspect of ultimate allegiance. That's what Jesus means when he says, if you would come after me, you have to hate everybody else by comparison. The phrase by comparison is not actually in the original language, but we understand that to be what Jesus is saying. He's certainly not saying you should hate your mom and dad or brother, sister, or spouse or kids. What he is saying is that you pledge your allegiance to all of those people in some way. But there may come a day where your allegiance to any one of those people is in conflict with your allegiance to Jesus. I hope not. But that may be. And should that day ever come, Jesus wins. Allegiance to him is ultimate. And it also means, ultimate means unto death. Unto death. It means all the way. It means that there's never going to be a time where you're faced with something and you say, okay, well, I'm done following Jesus now. It's what Jesus means when he says, if you don't pick up your cross or carry your cross, you can't be my disciple. The cross was the Roman Empire's most common form of capital punishment. And keep in mind, Jesus hasn't been crucified yet. See, we understand the cross on the other side of Jesus' resurrection. Imagine Jesus using that metaphor with a bunch of people who knew what a Roman crucifix was. This is what happens to you when you are an insurrectionist, when you rebel against culture. You get arrested and you get crucified. So Jesus is looking at these people who may have just, Bob might have just said to his buddy, hey, why don't you come with me? Let's go check out this Jesus guy. And they're like they're just accompanying Jesus. And Jesus turns around and says, hey, let me tell you what you're getting yourself into. If you're going to follow me, you pledge your allegiance to me over everyone and everything else. I mean, when someone says that sort of thing today, you immediately go, cult. Whoa. Right? I mean, this is the sort of thing that you hope your kids never get themselves into. This is what Jesus says. He says, if you're going to do this, you're going to pledge your allegiance to me all the way to death. Following me might at some point cause you to cut so hard against the way the world operates that the world will think that you're like a rebel, like you're an insurrectionist, and they might get rid of you. I brought a prop today. This is a book called The Martyr's Mirror. The subtitle to this book is 17 Centuries of Christian Martyrdom from the Time of Christ to AD 1660. Some Christian traditions, so some Mennonite traditions in the Christian church, this is how they prepare people for baptism. So you come to church, hey, I'm thinking about getting baptized. And they say, really? Okay, here. Read this 5,000-page book that chronicles thousands of horrifically gruesome murders of people who chose to follow Jesus. And when you're done, if you still want to do this, we'll baptize you. Now, that's a tradition that baptizes consenting adults. Traditions that baptize babies, it works the same way. In my native tradition in the Roman Catholic Church, where we baptize babies and we confirm adults, Oscar Romero, many of you recognize that name. He was the Archbishop of El Salvador in the late 70s. He referred to confirmation as the sacrament of martyrdom. So it doesn't matter. This is the point. You can get baptized as a baby, you can get confirmed as an adult, you can get dedicated as a baby, you can get baptized as an adult. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you get into this. What Jesus is saying is that what it means to be my disciple, which means student, it means apprentice, it means you're learning life from me, is it's an ultimate pledge of allegiance. That means it transcends everybody else, and it's all the way unto death. So nobody else gets to determine the meaning of your life or how you'll live it. Not your spouse, not your kids, not your parents, not your job, not HGTV, not the stock market, not the government, nobody. And there never comes a day where your allegiance to Jesus is something that you can just sort of take off the table. Ooh, well, it sounds like it's going to be hard. Okay, well, for right now, I'll just not follow Jesus, and I'll pick him back up in a minute. Do you still want to do it? I mean, I wonder if it thinned the crowd. Luke doesn't tell us. There were times where Jesus said stuff like this and it thinned the crowd. You know, you don't, quite frankly, you don't build a really numerically impressive church with this sort of stuff, right? Do you still want to do it? I love Jesus. Look, he would be like, so you nod, yeah, no, I still want to do it. Jesus, like, he's going to give you another chance to out. He's going to say, think about it. Seriously, think about it. Because you don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be that guy who started building something without checking first if he had enough money to finish the job. Everybody will just laugh at you. Shame was a big deal in their culture. That's how they would have heard that. Not just like, oh, they'll snicker. It's like, you will be ashamed. It's like the worst thing that can happen to you. You don't want to be that guy or girl, excuse me. You don't want to be that person who goes to war thinking, oh, I know I have half the troops of the enemy, but like, it'll work out. Do you still want to do it? You got to think about it. Being a disciple of Jesus is what Jesus is trying to do, is a pledge of ultimate allegiance, all the way unto death. That's a big deal. Now, if you still want to do it, just because you want to do it doesn't mean you will. I wanted to mow straight lines. I really did. It was sitting on the lawnmower was a much better job than hand trimming bunkers. Let me tell you. I really wanted to mow a straight line. It just didn't happen very often. At some point, if you're going to actually be a disciple of Jesus, your intention has to translate into action. Intention has to become intentionality. And this is where we're talking about the practice of planning, thinking. And when we think about freedom in a libertarian sense, we don't want to plan. Because you want to leave your options open. And I get it. I'm all for like creating space. But what ends up happening is we end up becoming a slave to whatever our sort of momentary whims are. But when freedom is the capacity to do as you should, the way that you translate your intention into faithful action is that you actually think about it. You plan. This is how this works. This is your practice. This is the thing that if you engage in will help you move toward freedom as the capacity to do as you should. Right? The Christian life is already broken into weeks. We spend a week in this rhythm of work and rest. Now, here's how most of us do this, I think. Most of us watch 6 days of the week as life just gets chaotic and nuts, right? It just goes sideways all over the place. And eventually we get like so fed up with that we take like a day and put everything back together. We put everything away in the house. We just sort of, get ourselves back to, okay. It's supposed to work the other way. When God creates, God imposes order on the chaos through work. So you didn't know you were doing this when you went to work. What you're doing when you go to work is you're imposing meaningful order on chaos. You're bringing meaning to something that would otherwise be meaningless. And everybody can do that. Some of you probably think that there are aspects of your job that feel just completely meaningless. If you took a moment to think them out, there's a person probably downstream that's impacted by whatever the thing is that you're doing. When you think about it that way, work becomes meaningful. You're imposing meaning on what otherwise could be just chaos and meaninglessness. That's what you're doing during your work week. Okay? Now, how that starts is God hovering over the chaos. That's how the Bible begins. The Spirit of God is hovering over the chaos, relational chaos, work chaos, romantic chaos, kid chaos, God blessed little soccer kid chaos, right? Like all the chaos, right? It's just you look at it, it's like, oh my gosh, chaos. God hovers over the chaos and then brings meaning and order to the chaos through a deliberate act of creation. Creation is bringing meaning to chaos. So what you do at the beginning of every week, not during your Sabbath, right? We talked about Sabbath. Sabbath is your time to enjoy. Sabbath is your time to live into life and not work. But when Sabbath is over and you got to go back to work, the first thing you do is you sit down and you plan. You think about what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. And most importantly, why you're going to do it. Literally, I do this every single Sunday night. I get my calendar out and I look at my world and I ask these questions. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? When am I going to do it? How am I going to do it? Essentially, what you're doing is the same calculation that you engage in to become a follower of Jesus in the first place. You're just doing that every week. So when Jesus looks at you and says, I want you to think about this. Before you start following me, I want you to be honest about what it's going to cost you and make sure that you're making an intentional decision to do this. I'm just suggesting you do that every week. That every single week you sit down and you look at your world and you look at all of your variables and you be honest with yourself about what following Jesus this week is actually going to cost you. And then pay that price. What is it going to mean to be faithful to Jesus this week? And then you decide how that's going to actually work. I wonder how many of you, how much of what you do with your life in terms of your actual time, how much of that was a product of deliberate thought? Where you literally brought your allegiance to Jesus into the conversation and said, okay, Jesus, I got a full week here. What are we going to do this week? And what are we not going to do this week? And why? Or how? This is sort of a basic thing for anybody who's actually trying to be intentional about being a disciple of Jesus. Otherwise, you sort of drift, you sort of meander. When Carrie and I built our house, we put a tile shower in our bathroom. It took the guy 8 weeks to do our tile shower, and no joke, I'm glad he took that long. No joke, he spent a whole week, just sitting in our bathroom planning. He did not lay a single tile. He sat there with a pencil and some tiles, and he just created a plan. Because he knows if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't take the time to do that, and he just starts slapping tiles around, eventually he's going to run himself into a corner where things don't fit, or we're going to have this like little strip at the top that looks nasty. He took the time to plan. As Christian people, if you want to be intentional about following Jesus, you got to plan. You have to decide how you're going to impose meaning on your world. And your life is broken into this rhythm where you have the opportunity to do that. I think if you start doing this, you're going to discover you have a lot more time than you thought you did. You're probably going to discover that you spend a whole lot of time doing stuff that Jesus does not care at all about or would specifically tell you to stop doing. I'm like, look, I'm all for fantasy football, but when someone complains to me about like life's crazy and they don't have any time, and I find out that they spent 6 hours in their fantasy football league, you have time, guys. You have time. You probably find that you got more time than you think you have. You probably discover that you're spending a whole lot of time doing stuff Jesus doesn't care about or doesn't want you to do. You may discover, maybe you're more deliberate than you thought you were without actually being deliberate about it. You may find that you've got an opportunity to ask questions like, hey, what are we not doing that maybe Jesus would want us to do? I've always said I'd like to create more time to be able to pray. I just never actually sit down and create the space to do that. I would really love to spend a little more time reading the scriptures. I've just never actually taken the time to sit down and create the space to do it. We've always said that as a family, we would love to go and serve somebody. We just never do it. The reason we don't is because you don't take the time to plan. And I'm in it with you. I know planning seems like a very, this is just, what is this? Just like a leadership talk, Mike? I'm telling you, this is a sacred act. It is theologically anchored in how God orders and creates the universe. You're made in God's image. God gives you a life and says, I want you to impose meaning on it, to be intentional. You've said you want to pledge your allegiance to me. That means ultimate and unto death. Okay, bring that into your everyday life and decide what you're going to do, what you're not going to do based on your actual allegiance to me. The gospel of Jesus Christ ought to convert us at the very deep base level of our desire. Faith is about what you believe, but it's just as much about what you want. It's just as much a guttural thing. What is it that you want in life, and why do you want it? When you hear the story about God coming to be with us in the person of Jesus Christ, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, touching lepers, taking on the hypocritical religious establishment, going to death and then 3 days later rising from the dead and repaying the world with mercy and grace. Part of what's supposed to happen there is a conversion of our desire. It seems sort of silly to want anything else more than to follow Jesus. Seriously. Put something else in the blank and see if it makes any sense by comparison. If you don't want Jesus, nobody can help you. Like this, none of this makes any sense. But if you do want Jesus, at some point your intention, your want has to translate into action. You have to become the kind of person who hovers over the chaos. And based on what Jesus has taught you and is teaching you, you actually bring some order and some meaning to your world so that you can actually live the life that God in Christ created you to live. All right, we're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion together. For those of you who are new here, we do this every Sunday.